Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sarah and team. Nice to see all of you this morning. Welcome. It's good to have you with us this morning, and I'd like to welcome those of you joining us online on our YouTube stream. I'm sure all of us are intrigued by stories of people finding buried treasure. I don't know if you know, but the largest buried treasure find here in America was called the Saddle Ridge Hoard. It was found in February 2013 up near Mount Shasta in Northern California. A couple were out one morning walking their dog on a remote area of their property, and as they're walking along, they saw the lid of a tin can sticking out of the ground. Now that piqued their interest, and so they decided they're going to take the time to unbury it, and the can was unusually heavy. But they picked it up, and as they're carrying it back to their house, it was so heavy that the lid broke open, and dozens of gold coins spilled out onto the ground. They thought, what on earth is happening here? They went back to the site where they found that can, and they found 7 more cans buried in the ground, filled with glimmering gold coins. Now, they found in total 1,411 gold coins with a face value of nearly $28,000. But appraised for today, those coins were worth $10 million. Now, no one knows really where these coins came from. Some have speculated maybe they were stolen or they belonged to Wells Fargo Bank, but no one really knows for sure. The couple were able to keep the $10 million. The sad postscript of the story that after getting the money, they divorced. But, I mean, can you imagine finding such a treasure as that? What would you do with it? All of us come from different backgrounds, and we've learned different things about money, right? Some of us perhaps were raised in a family that was very poor, and we had very little. Some of us, I would imagine most of us, grew up in a family that wasn't wealthy per se, but there was always enough money for the necessities of life, be it food and clothing and shelter and whatnot. Some of us were raised, of course, in a home that was very well off. But whatever our background, money and the things we own plays a very significant role in our sense of security. And this is what Jesus was saying in the passage Mike read to us just a moment ago. Jesus warns us of the danger of making money the primary focus of our life, of believing the lie that money, and lots of it, please, is what secures our future and is what makes us happy. Now, if I may, let's listen again to what Jesus said about this, and beginning at verse 19, when he said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, if you would skip down to verse 24, Jesus said, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Now, these words are hard-hitting. Would you not agree? Particularly where Jesus says, you cannot serve both God and money. I once heard the story of a classroom. First day back in class, a teacher asked her 5th grade class how their families had celebrated the Christmas holiday. One little boy said, "Well, early Christmas morning, we got up early, we went to Mass, we came home, ate breakfast, and then we opened up our presents." Great. A little girl raised her hand and said, we're Baptists, so we went to the Christmas Eve candlelight service, as you do. And we got up early the next morning, ate breakfast, then opened our presents. Well, the last boy in the class said, "Well, we don't celebrate Christmas in my family because we're Jewish. But on Christmas morning, we got up early, ate breakfast. We got in the family station wagon. We went down to our father's department store, and he showed us all the empty shelves. Then he took us back into the office and he opened up the floor safe and showed us all the stacked money that he had made during the Christmas holiday. We formed a circle, we joined hands, and we sang, "What a friend we have in Jesus." That's a true story. No, it's not. It's not a true story. Now, today's lesson is set within the context of a message that Jesus gave called the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And in the Sermon on the Mount, what we see Jesus doing, he's pushing back against the tradition of the religious leaders. He's making very clear the meaning of the law of God. And in doing that, he's confronting the teaching, the attitudes, the conduct of the religious leaders of that day, namely the scribes and Pharisees. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees taught that material wealth was the true sign of God's favor and blessing. You see, the scribes and Pharisees not only loved to impress people with their piety, they loved to impress people with their wealth, because that says, we are of God. In fact, Jesus later would point out in Luke chapter 16 that the religious leaders were lovers of money. They had this skewed sense of the importance of material things. And that's important to have in the back of our minds as we read this passage. Now, those of you with an eye for detail will notice in verses 19 through 21 that Jesus differentiates between two kinds of treasures: earthly treasures and heavenly treasures. Now, what are earthly treasures? Now, it's not incredibly difficult to know what that is, right? These are all of the things that we ascribe value to, be it money or real estate or homes or automobiles or investment portfolios, savings accounts, businesses, and whatnot. But we also treasure things that are of a non-material nature, namely our career, our success, our reputation, and so on. Now, here's the key. Is Jesus suggesting that these things, that earthly treasures, are inherently evil? Not at all. That's not what he's saying. And he's not saying give all your money away in this passage. So let's demystify that as we proceed in this message. It's not wrong to make money. It's not wrong to save. It is not wrong to enjoy our blessings in life. The scriptures encourage the enjoyment of what God gives us. But Jesus is warning us to not believe the lie that our happiness and our security is ultimately found in the things that we possess. Of believing the lie that the more we have, the more secure we are. He says, don't hoard your treasures. I seldom watch reality television, but there was a program on that I watched from time to time with I'll say, fascination and also with profound sadness. It was called Hoarding, Buried Alive. Have you ever seen this program before? I mean, it's fascinating to watch. Now, the program, of course, is about people who have a hoarding disorder, and they have this compulsion to save everything they get their hands on. And folks who have this hoarding disorder experience tremendous emotional distress at the thought of parting with the things that they have. Even most of the things have no value whatsoever, but they just can't give them up. And you go into their homes, and usually there are these very narrow pathways winding from room to room. And things are just cluttered to the ceiling. I've been in homes like this. I'm sure, have you ever been in a home like this? I mean, it's very sad. Well, Jesus is warning us of hoarding earthly treasures. And he gives us 3 reasons why. First of all, Jesus wants us to know that earthly treasures, number one, they don't last. They don't last forever. Now, you'll notice in verses 19 and 20, Jesus talks about 3 forms of wealth that were very common in his day: clothing, food, and money or gold. Now, rich people, let's start at the beginning. Rich people were commonly identified by the clothing that they wore. the rich wore articles of clothing that had been dyed purple and were accented with golden-colored thread. Now, very rich people, their clothing was typically made out of wool, which, as we know, is the favorite cuisine of moths. Doesn't last. And now, depending on the translation next, you'll see Jesus mentions rust twice in verses 19 and 20. Now, people thinking Jesus is talking about how rust can tarnish money. He's not talking about that at all. The word rust in Greek is the Greek word brosis, which means eating. And what he's talking about, actually, is how rich people would stockpile provisions of food and grain. And what would happen is that insects and rats and other vermin would get into the food supply and ruin it. The food wouldn't last either. Then, of course, he talks about money, material wealth, if you will. Now, we know, of course, sounds silly to say this, but back in the day, rich people didn't have access to banks. There were no such thing as banks. So they didn't have safety deposit boxes or any kind of security or anything like that where they could keep their valuables. Typically, they would actually bury their riches and hope and pray that thieves wouldn't find their stash and steal their riches. And of course, we know the greatest thief of all is what? Is death. We won't take what we own with us when we die. And the point Jesus is making is that no matter what kinds of precautions we take, these earthly treasures that we have slip through our fingers. They're easily lost. They're easily stolen. They're forfeited when our day is done. I believe I've told you before the story of a friend of mine named John, who lives in Cleveland. He was the IT person of the church that I served at there in that town. Years ago, John and a few of his college classmates launched a technology business during the time of the dot-com boom. And John and his partners became spectacularly wealthy overnight. They became multimillionaires, all. And they instead of selling their company for a huge profit, when they had an opportunity to do so, they decided to hang on to the company, believing that they would make even more money. And you remember the dot-com bubble when it burst? All these technology businesses just went belly up. John confided in me, and I don't think he would mind me telling you, he tells everyone actually, that he lost $4 million. Gone. But that's the nature of earthly treasures. And we strive diligently to accumulate and protect the things that we think will bring us happiness and security. But these things have, folks, I'm telling you, these things have a cruel way of disappearing. They don't last. The second thing that Jesus tells us about earthly treasures is that they can easily turn our heart away from God. They become the focus of our lives. And this is what Jesus says in verse 21. When he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And it's an undeniable fact of life. Our hearts pursue what we treasure. And that treasure usually dictates how we choose to live our lives. It sets the agenda. So how can we determine what we value most? Well, if you're a person of faith, let me ask you to reflect on 4 questions very quickly. 4 questions that help us determine what we value most. First of all, this question: do I compromise godly character in the pursuit of material gain? In other words, if I lie, if I cheat, if I take advantage of vulnerable people for financial gain, that says something very clear about my heart. It says that I'm being dishonest. It says that I'm greedy. So do I compromise godly character for material gain? Second question is this: has my desire to acquire ruined important relationships? All of us here, of course, in the Los Angeles area remember the name J. Paul Getty. Some of you have been to his museum in Los Angeles. He founded the Getty Oil Company in 1949, and by 1957, it was believed he was the richest man in America. He had the controlling interest in over 200 companies. He had so much, but the one thing J. Paul Getty never had was happiness. He was married and divorced 5 times. He once said that he would have given his entire fortune for one successful marriage. I personally don't believe that. But that's what he said. But his ex-wife said that they could not live with a man who was so consumed with greed and consumed by his success. Now, we all know that Getty donated millions to charitable causes, and yet he was so miserly that he installed a payphone in his Sutton Place mansion in Surrey, England, because he didn't want his friends making long-distance calls on his dime, so to speak. Now, some of us who are older remember back in 1973, J. Paul Getty had a grandson who was kidnapped and held for ransom. The kidnappers asked for a ransom of $17 million. Getty himself negotiated that down to $2.2 million. Now, strange, why $2.2 million? Because it was the maximum amount deductible from his taxes. But he paid the $2.2 million after the kidnappers cut off the ear of his grandson. Now, after he was released, J. Paul Getty III, the grandson, called to thank his grandfather for paying the ransom, but Getty refused to take the telephone call because he believed that the kidnapping had actually been orchestrated by his grandson. And that wasn't the case, as it turns out. And devastated by post-traumatic stress, J. Paul Getty III became a drug addict. He was incapacitated by a drug overdose and died at the age of 54. Has money destroyed relationships that are important to you? Here's the third question. How do I respond when I lose material things? Oh. Now, we've all heard the saying, money talks. Isn't that true? I don't know about your money, but my money says goodbye. Well, it's not funny, but now it is. But two months ago, I had my bank account compromised twice. And thieves stole thousands and thousands of dollars twice. I mean, you talk about panic. Oh, thankfully, my bank quickly restored the stolen funds to my account. But my initial reaction in discovering that I had a bunch of money missing was over-the-top anxiety and distress. I mean, I felt like I was in financial freefall. It was terrible. I later reflected on what happened and how all of this impacted me emotionally. And it was a real eye-opener how attached I am to what sits over there at Valley Strong Credit Union. A real eye-opener. But how would you respond if you lost something you treasured? Here's the fourth question, very quickly. What would I do if I finally came into a fortune? If I came into a fortune, what would you do with the money? Would you burn through it by buying extravagant things? By the way, that's what usually happens when people get a big sum of money. Think about all the lottery winners. That is kind of a curse, but it happens. Would you help others in need? Would you actually give to the work of God's kingdom? 4 questions worth considering. Now, let's bore down and look at verses 22 and 23, because Jesus talks about how money can distort our view on spiritual things. Now, at a first glance, these words sound really strange. They seem kind of out of place, kind of a non sequitur to the rest of the teaching. But Jesus said this, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Now let's understand something very quickly. Jesus, as he talks about our eyes, he's speaking metaphorically. Our natural eyes give us the ability to see the world around us. And if our eyes are bad, our vision will be distorted. But Jesus is actually talking about our spiritual vision, and here's what he's getting at. If our spiritual eyesight is correctly adjusted, our lives will be guided by an eternal purpose. However, if our eyesight is distorted by materialism, it blinds us to the enduring value of the kingdom of God. Now, Jesus gives us a third warning, and by the way, it doesn't get easier. The third thing he says, that earthly treasures can enslave us. He puts it this way in verse 24. No one can serve two masters. You'll either hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Here's Jesus jarring us awake by saying that we become the servant of what we treasure most. It's just a fact of life. And he's asking here, will you serve God or will you serve money? And I want you to notice how strong his language is. He says, no one can serve two masters. Now, Jesus did not say, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to serve two masters. No, he doesn't say that at all. He says it's impossible. And Jesus makes no bones about it. God will not tolerate a rival when it comes to the issue of what our greatest treasure is. You see, at the end of the day, Jesus understands that money is a tool or it's an idol. Make God the treasure of your heart. I want to share with you the story of a young man named Sam Polk. By the time he was 30 years of age, Sam Polk made millions of dollars working on Wall Street. He said, and I quote, "I felt a tremendous sense of power and importance." And at the age of 30, he quit his job on Wall Street and went to work for a hedge fund in the state of New York. And his obsession with money only got worse. Polk, in this, you see his picture, in this interview he gave to the New York Times, he describes how he became angry one Christmas with only a $3.6 million Christmas bonus. Oh, what a shame. But he was angry about that. In his mind, it wasn't big enough. But one day, Sam Polk had an epiphany. He realized, man, I am addicted. I am addicted to money. And he said this to the New York Times, and I quote, "I came to realize I had been using money as the thing that would quell all of my fears. I had the belief that maybe someday I would get enough money that I would no longer live in fear. And one of the lies I learned on Wall Street is that wealth promises security, but it doesn't deliver." Now, you may be sitting here this morning and you switched your brain off a long time ago. It happens. But I want to say this. You don't have to earn the salary of a hedge fund manager or command the salary of a corporate CEO to be addicted to money and to be its slave. Folks, we can just as easily be enslaved to the things we don't have and that desire to get them. And so here's the question. How do we resist getting pulled in that strong tractor beam of money and possessions, that gravitational pull of money? Here's where you start. Stop believing the lie that earthly treasures is the key to happiness and security. If you have a Bible in your lap, I hope you do, turn it to Matthew chapter 6 and notice the rest of the verses in this 6th chapter. Jesus challenges us to find our security in God. And he tells us, God, he takes care of the sparrows. He takes care of the flowers of the field. And you, the crowning glory of his creation, will God not take care of you And the answer is, of course, God will do that. And in God, we find the freedom and joy of His kingdom. And here's what happens when we do that, when we find that freedom and joy in the kingdom of God. Our attachment to the things of this world, that attachment is lessened. And our hearts start getting pulled in a different direction. They start getting pulled toward the kingdom of God. And here's the deal. Jesus says, your heart can only be one place at a time. If it's tethered here, it can't be there. If it's tethered there, it can't be here. One brings worry and anxiety. The other one brings joy and freedom and contentment. And this is what we have to decide. I close with this story about a wealthy businessman who's on vacation. He's walking along a beach one morning and he meets a fisherman. And the businessman was surprised to see that the fisherman was sitting there on the beach, relaxing, his toes in the sand. And so he engages him in a conversation and says, well, why aren't you out there fishing? And the fisherman said, well, I've caught enough for the day. I'm good. And the businessman looks at his watch and he says, it's early in the morning. You could catch more fish. And the fisherman said, what would I do with them? The businessman said, well, you could take them down to the market and sell them and make more money. If you made more money, you could buy a bigger boat and better fishing gear. And if you had a bigger boat and better fishing gear, you could go out into deeper water. You could catch even more fish and make even more money. And if you sold all the fish, you could buy a fleet of boats and have several people working for you. And the fisherman asks, then what would I do? Well, the businessman says, well, you could sit back and enjoy life. And the fisherman looked over the top of his sunglasses and said, what do you think I'm doing? I close this morning with a question. Where does God fit into your life? These days, so busy, so frantic, trying to secure our future. I suppose most of us have a pretty good idea where we stand financially, but are you growing rich in the things of God? Jesus is saying to us, don't forget to do that. Don't forget to do that. And it all comes down to this. When we deposit the resources of our time and talent and treasure in the work of God's kingdom, we are investing in something that we will never lose. Nothing will ever diminish what we do for God. And so when we lay hold of this treasure, that's when we discover that we are rich indeed. And God's people said, Amen. Would you join me in a prayer as the team comes back for a final song? Would you pray with me, please? Lord, there are so many things in this world that compete for our deepest affections. Somehow we have embraced the belief that the key to a contented and secure life is found in what we have and what we own. And our prayer this morning is that you would free us from the bondage of believing that we have to fend for ourselves in this world. Instead, help us, Lord, to find our security in you. And so we pause in this moment to give thanks for your promise to supply everything we need. And we pause in this moment to say thanks for your astonishing generosity. And we pause to say thanks that you've given us the greatest gift of all, your Son Jesus. And we offer this prayer to you in his name. God's people said.